Welcome everyone, welcome, please take a seat. Today is Wednesday. We have gotten our reset in EU as well, and apparently this is also the most exciting thing to happen in history on this day because there is nothing else worth mentioning about this December the 4th. So, with nothing else worth talking about, today we have our update. Since 8 days ago we had our raid overview of the situation in the raid when it comes to the progression of the bosses, the meta, state of specs, the DPS rankings, the healer, the tank popularity, etc, etc. So for today we have way more things changing, as of course last week was in the middle of New Year's Eve, and plenty of guilds were pausing their raids, etc, etc. So this time we have more things worth talking about. Talking about things worth talking about, let's start by talking about something that is not worth talking about, which is tanks and their popularity in the raid. This has not changed since the first week that we looked at this. The second week proceeded just about the same, and the third week also continued to have Protection Warrior, quite the most popular tank, followed by Blood Death Knight. So this is still the same regardless of the week we have been in. Where we actually do see the significant change this week is in healers, because we started week 1 and then week 2, and we mentioned how close 4 different specs were. We had Holy Priest and Holy Paladin, followed very, very closely by Preservation and Restoration. There was the gap after the first 4 specs. Shaman, Discipline and Mistweaver were quite a bit more down when we checked last week. This week we have the turnaround. Preservation Evoker is now ahead of all of the other healers, almost by 10% over Holy Priest. It's a significant jump compared to what we saw last week. So it looks like in this sort of pause for the end of the year, more players have had time to reroll to Preservation Evoker, to respec and change their main to Preservation Evoker, and now they are ahead of the other healers. We still have the previous other 3 healers part of the gang at the top: Holy Priest, Holy Paladin and Restoration Druid, still very, very high in play rate, but now there is a clear winner at the moment in terms of popularity when it comes to healers. The situation is changing also a little bit when it comes to DPS. This was our very early baby rankings in the first week of the release of the season. Then we had the second week of the release of the season, and now we have the third week of the release of the season. The most visible change, if you look at all of these, is the growth of Unholy Death Knight, for example, which we will also see very soon when it comes to the DPS of the spec. You can see that now Unholy has passed Frost Death Knight. It started being less than half as played as Frost, and now they are above them. That is definitely the main change for the week. What I would like to put your eyes on for the following weeks is perhaps the eventual possible predicted growth of Arms Warrior, which at the moment is still not that high. If we have to be honest, Fury Warrior is still quite the popular pick overall compared to Arms, but with Arms Warrior gaining more from their tier set and perhaps having more overall value in execute phases of bosses, etc, etc, maybe in the following weeks Arms will be gaining some more popularity over Fury Warrior. As we are talking about performance, we can also very easily and quickly glide past the healer's performance, because it has remained more or less the same as last week, with Preservation Evoker having a gap from Restoration Druid, which also has a gap from the rest of the healers. It is of course still worth pointing out that the power of healers is not really all just in how high their HPS is. It's not nearly as conclusive as the DPS of DPS specs, of course, but it might still be indicative of their overall power, especially when you compare this with the popularity of the specs. And it's somewhat like this. The only outlier in this HPS ranking compared to how popular the specs are is Restoration Shaman at the moment. Now, since we are talking about the performance of healers, let's move on, of course, to the performance of the DPS. Now, as we pointed out in the popularity, the main change of the week is going to be the continued rise of Unholy Death Knight, because we started the whole deal on week 1, and Unholy Death Knight was right here, which reads as pretty much one of the worst DPS specs and the second worst melee spec, only above Survival Hunter, right when we started. The second week, Unholy had a significant jump, started doing much better out of nowhere, and then this week, now Unholy is in the top 2, significantly sieging the #1 spot of Outlaw Rogue. So the question is, what happened? Is Unholy somehow super OP with its tier set, right? Is it something changing, significantly with the power of that bonus? Not really. I mean, the tier set might be strong, but it's definitely not the reason why we had this jump. The main reason and the main change is that the Unholy Aura talent, which is the 20% pet damage increase 8 yards around you, has been bugged for quite a while. Why? Because the hitboxes of the bosses was so large that your pets were essentially going to hit the boss further than 8 yards away from you. TLDR, Unholy Death Knights were losing most of that 20% pet damage increase, because the center of the boss, the giant boss hitbox, was too large for the pet to actually be within 8 yards. Now, with the hotfix that changed this, so now the hitbox starts from the edge of the boss's hitbox and not the center. Now your pets as Unholy are properly gaining this damage buff. This totals out to be some 10-ish% damage increase for Unholy, and that's where they have been gaining their significant damage increase, as we have been seeing in their performance rising in the past couple of weeks. So that is our weekly hot topic when it comes to DPS changes in the rankings. There are of course still a few movements here and there, like for example, Retribution Paladin has lost 4 to 5 ranks compared to last week. We also have specs like Windwalker Monk losing out a bit more, Demonology Warlock losing out a bit more, Havoc Demon Hunter, a significant rise of Retribution Paladin, which gains a whole bunch of ranks. We also have the surprise increase of a couple of mage specs, while Arcane might not be too surprising because Arcane is quite popular now, it's quite used. Fire Mage is also doing quite better, to the point that they are actually passing Arcane Mage in performance at the very least. That might be surprising to many players, considering how few mage players you have seen playing Fire recently in the raid, or even in Mythic Plus, or even in the open world actually, together with another decent increase in performance of Balanced Druid, which now passes the middle of the pack after what feels like months and months and tiers of Balanced Druid being super popular, but at the same time always being towards the bottom of overall performance. Now they are actually in the top half of the performers in Mythic raiding at the moment. There might be a few questions sparked by these lists. For example, why is it that Demonology Warlock is so popular and has remained so popular since the end of Shadowlands, yet they are not really doing that well? Or it feels like they don't seem to be performing that well, despite being very popular and very used. How is it? Well, a lot of the performance of the Demonology Warlock has been tainted for months by the fact that they were the primary recipient of power infusion. So every time you looked at their logs, they basically had a power infusion cooldown just for themselves in every fight. Recently, we have seen that while the practice of giving power infusion to your Demonology Warlocks is definitely still a thing, there have been more differences, there have been more options. For example, giving power infusion to your Unholy Death Knight, for example, giving power infusion to your Arcane Mage. So we do have less overall power infusions being handed out to Demolocks, like we saw in Sepulchre, where almost 100% of the power infusions were going to Demonology Warlocks. Now, instead, there are more options, so the overall performance of Demolock in the rankings is bound to lower down a little bit because of this. We can also start looking at this with our seasonal overall changes, our nice squiggly lines in here. For example, these are melee changes throughout the tier since the release of the raid. You can see that Unholy Death Knight across most of the other lines being more or less where they started. The only significant change is the Unholy one, which starts at the third worst and then proceeds to be the second best when it comes to melee DPS over the course of 3 weeks. When it comes to range DPS, you do have a quite significant gap at the top where you see Marksmanship Hunter starting the best and remaining the best out of all of the range specs. The only other couple of significant changes is the second best, as we mentioned, Demonology. Demo started second best, and then over a few weeks they have been going down and down and down, and now they are middle of the pack like the rest. And then the other one is Fire Mage. You see that dip towards the middle of the graph, that's fire, which then suddenly starts ramping up and up and up and going towards the middle of the pack as well. So these have been the two main changes when it comes to range DPS, Demo and Fire Mage. It is interesting, however, to compare these rankings, these simple rankings from Warcraft logs, to the tier list of Subcreation, a very useful site that many of you might already be using, which shows things like these: the tier list for the melee DPS having specs like Windwalker or specs like Fury Warrior, which are towards the middle of the pack, or even bottom half like Fury, still showing as quite high in performance, and then specs which are very high like Subtlety, which is currently the third highest performers in the raid, is in the B tier all of a sudden. Well, this has more to do with a mix, not just about how you are doing overall, but also how many of you are performing, and also in an overall damage comparison with all of the bosses. For example, while Subtlety is the third best performer in the raid, there is still 1/6 Subtlety players than there are Fury Warrior players. So looking at this type of detailed ranking for the DPS specs, this is the one for the melee, and then this is the one for the ranged DPS so far in the raid. And that was all as far as the actual specs were concerned. What about the actual raid? Number one, we have the boss difficulty, TLDR, how difficult it is currently to progress each boss, and these are the kill percentages of the bosses. So we start with, of course, predictably, Aranog and Primal Council being quite handy, above the 10% mark for both of them in terms of kill chance, and then we have a tremendous drop for pretty much all of the following bosses. You know, Taros, already being the third boss, is barely at 2% kill chance, followed by Sennart, more or less on the same level, and then Diurna, Datia and Kurog, all very, very low. This is quite worse than what we looked at in previous tiers so far. As I said, the release schedule might also have played a hand in just how much progress there have been on these bosses throughout the Christmas holidays, but it might still be a pretty good indicator of how challenging the bosses are. And we can also finish this detailed list of the bosses by looking at how much damage is required to clear each bosses, and also, more importantly, how much HPS is required. Because while the damage might not be nearly as relevant, because it simply depends on how many targets you have to kill. For example, you can see here that the Primal Council requires the most damage, but that's simply because there is 4 of them who take shared damage, so it looks like you are doing way more than you actually are. Meanwhile, of course, the HPS is actually much more relevant on these fights. You can see that from when you're starting the raid on Aranog, by the time you reach Kurog in the middle of the raid, you have already doubled, more than doubled, your HPS requirements on the fight. Or that if you get past Taros, thinking it was a very heavy HPS check for your guild, well, look at this on the bright side. Kurog will now require more than 20% healing than you just had to do on Taros, because of how heavy the healing requirement will be on Kurog Grim Totem, for example. But with this out of the way for the bosses themselves, not just the specs in the raid for this week, we are done for today. As we are finishing today, we're still looking closely the current progression of guilds. We still are on the low and slow side when it comes to boss kill participation. I'm still quite interested in what is causing this overall, but I guess the only solution to this is to wait and see how things progress in the raid. So For the time being, we are stopping here, and we are starting, of course, our closure by thanking all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and helping the growth of myself and this channel. You can still, however, support in other ways that don't include having to take out money from your favorite e-girl simp fund. For example, liking and commenting down below and subscribing to this channel are still perfectly fine free ways to show your support. You can also support me by following me on Twitter. Besides the social media cringery, it can be helpful to get notified whenever I go live on stream, for example. That might be one of the only few useful things Twitter can do for you. And of course, mentioning the stream after a long hiatus of a Christmas holiday pause, I am back streaming on Twitch. Generally, I start streaming around 10 p.m. Central European times, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. So, with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I love it. I love it, the days I am thirsty and I feel like water tastes very good. Those are the best days.